in the conversation. So we're going to get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. As I mentioned a little earlier, my name is Abby Lee Hallett. I am the Audience Engagement Coordinator here at the Art Gallery of Windsor. And I'll mostly be doing the technical side tonight and just the introduction before I hand it over to these fine folks that you see here. So before we get our talk started, just a few things to go over. And the first one being our land acknowledgement. I do like to show it on the screen, as unfortunately sometimes the closed captions do not pick up all of the words properly, so you'll be able to read it here. And this is something, again, I always say for folks who have been to a lot of our events, this is something that you've heard a number of times, but I encourage and invite everybody to engage with this in a mindful way and in a way of awareness, particularly given the topic of tonight's discussion. So I will read out the land acknowledgement now. While this conversation and recording is happening digitally, today I want to acknowledge that the Art Gallery of Windsor is physically situated on Anishinaabe territory, the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, comprised of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, as well as territory upon which the Haudenosaunee have historically been established. Today, the Anishinaabe of the Three Fires Confederacy are represented by Walpole Island First Nation. We want to state our respect for the historical and ongoing authority of Walpole Island First Nation over their territory. Despite experiencing lack of peace and friendship mutually from settlers and their state representatives throughout our shared history, Indigenous peoples have and continue to live and thrive as they have always done on these lands upon which we now have the privilege to live out our lives, open our minds and hearts, delve into our creativity, and foster community connection through the visual arts. So as we gather today, let us remember the history of these lands, the land, and the peoples, and let us engage in lifelong learning and unlearning as we work together to move towards a kinder shared future. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing now. That was the main part of the slideshow that I'd had. And I'm going to go on now. In the chat, I'm going to share for all of our digital events and just events in general, we do have a code of conduct. So if you would like to look that over, I encourage you to do so as well. Really goes into sort of the norms for engagement in these conversations so that we can learn, unlearn, open minds and hearts, gain new perspectives in a way that is respectful, kind, and curious. And speaking of conversations, this is why we're all here. One of our pillars in our new strategic plan at the Art Gallery of Windsor. And we really want to be able to spark community conversations around ideas and issues such as history, culture, and society while leveraging the gallery's collection and exhibitions. You might have seen some similar conversations late last year and early this year that delved into some of these topics, and keep an eye out because we're hopefully going to be having more conversations like this in the future, and we would love to see you there to engage in them. So with that, before I hand it off to our panelists here, we're going to do something, if you've been at our talks, a little differently. You haven't done this before, so we'll see how we do with this. I'm going to launch a Zoom poll, and I'd love for folks to be able to fill out the poll. It's just a multiple choice to kind of see what our perspectives are before going into the conversation. And we're going to check in at the end of the conversation with some similar questions to see if anything has changed. So I'm going to launch this poll, and it looks like folks can see this. Okay, great. This is my first time doing that. So I'm going to give a little bit of time for folks to answer, and then once we hit about a minute, I'll close the poll and we'll see what the responses are. right, I'll give about 15 more seconds if anyone else wants to add in their response, and then we'll show the results. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Hopefully folks can see this. Okay, there we go. Looks like it's going. So for our first question, we had, did you honor the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation this year? And it looks like quite a lot of people in our conversation did. We have 91% of people that said yes, 9% that said no. For our second question, have you read the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada? Again, we have a good percentage who said yes, about 64%, and 36% who said no to that. And then last but not least, question number 3, have you read the story of Phyllis Webstad and her orange shirt? 82% have said yes, they have, and 18% said they have not. So I'm going to stop sharing. Give us a bit of an idea of who we have here, and I will see kind of how this, if our perspectives change as we continue through the talk. But without further ado now, I'm going to get to that talk, and I'm going to introduce our moderator for the night and then hand it over to him. So we have with us tonight, Craig Pearson, who's going to be our moderator. So I'm going to introduce Craig, and then the floor will be for Craig and our panelists. So Craig Pearson is the managing editor of the Windsor Star and a longtime daily journalist and educator. He has worked as a journalist for 35 years at the Sherbrooke Record, the Montreal Daily News, and for the last 31 years, the Windsor Star. The Montreal native has covered arts and entertainment and City Hall and everything in between, served as a war correspondent in Afghanistan, and has won numerous awards, including as a co-winner of the National Newspaper Award Citation of Merit for the Windsor Star's 2014 gun running series. He has a college diploma in social sciences, a bachelor's degree in journalism, and a master's degree in communication studies. He has taught journalism part-time at the University of Windsor for 22 years, and he is the author of 2 From the Vault history books based on Windsor Star photos. He has hosted many community events, including live televised election debates, and has moderated various panel discussions, like this one. He also serves as the chair of the St. Clair College Journalism Public Advisory Committee. He's married with 1 son and remains active in the community. So with that, I'm going to hand the conversation over to Craig. Craig, take it away.
Thank you very much, Abby Lee, for that wonderful introduction and everything you did to lead up to that. And I'd like to welcome everybody to the community conversation. How can we honor the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation? This is sort of the first community conversation that the Art Gallery is launching. And what's cool about these discussions is that, yeah, they might talk about art, but they're probably going to go way beyond it. I think it's a great initiative. And I'd like to thank the Art Gallery of Windsor for not just starting the community conversation series, because it brings art and discussion beyond the walls of the gallery, but for inviting me to moderate the inaugural one. And it's a particularly relevant and timely one. September 30th marked the first official National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. It's also Orange Shirt Day. It's recognized as a federal holiday across Canada. However, a lot of the provinces did not make it a statutory holiday, as including in Ontario. A lot of people worked, myself included. So there is much debate on how we should honor this day. Should everybody have the day off? If everybody has the day off, should they also just treat it as a holiday? Or should they as well spend time trying to learn about Indigenous history in Canada? So tonight, we will explore the issue. We encourage respectful questions and hope that we can all learn something simply by listening about an important topic that goes to the root of history in this country. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panelists. And if I do not say proper pronunciation on some of these words, please do and not hesitate to correct me. But anyway, Leila Paugh is an Indigenous activist with Mi'kmaq roots, proudly lives and promotes her Indigenous heritage and culture in her personal and professional life. Leila has worked as a paramedic with the Niagara Paramedics and Dispatchers for over 20 years. A social activist and equity champion, Leila is the equality officer and a health and safety co-chair at her CUPE 911 local. She is also a member of both CUPE Ontario's Indigenous Council and the Women's Committee. Leila is a graduate from Lakehead University with 2 degrees in geography and Indigenous studies. An avid traveler and volunteer, she has traveled and experienced diverse cultures and histories on all 7 continents. That could be a story in its own. When Leila is not traveling and working, she volunteers for a couple of months every other year in a remote Inuit community as one of the leaders of the kayak program, and her team won the Laureate of the Arctic Inspiration Prize by the North for the North initiative to recognize and encourage teamwork for the betterment of life in Canada's North. Welcome aboard, Leila. David Pitawanakwat is a 3rd-year law student at the University of Windsor and president of the Shkawbewisag Student Law Society. He is originally from the Wik-May-Wakwang Unceded Indian Reserve, but he currently lives in Detroit, where he is an advocate for the urban, veteran, and Indigenous community. Welcome, David. And Alicia Bear-Morin is a 1st-year law student at the University of Windsor and in charge of communications for the Shkawbewisag Student Law Society. She is Cree from the Treaty 10 territory and stewards the Churchill River. Her work includes addressing First Nations boiled water advisories and finding solutions to First Nation water infrastructure needs. In this role, she worked closely with elders, chiefs, and knowledge holders in addressing the federal government's responsibility and role in ending First Nations boil water advisories. Alicia's academic achievements and commitment to community have led her to complete intensive hands-on research, which gave her a strong foundation. Her past research projects involved the role of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in the development of the Indigenous Studies program at McMaster University, Blueberries as Medicine, which I particularly like, and community well-being. Welcome, Alicia. And so, therefore, it's time to start the discussion with the first question. And that is, what does the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation mean to you? And why don't we start with Leila?
Sure, thank you. The National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, to me, it's like a day of remembrance. So I find that people often focus on reconciliation and less about the truth. And this day should be used to raise awareness and encourage communication. So I'd like to see everybody to take time and learn about residential schools, learn about things like the 60s CUPE, learn more about the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited people, and learn about impacts on Indigenous communities that have happened over centuries and still adversely affect generations of Indigenous people today. I feel that the truth will help bring reconciliation and much needed healing to the Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians.
Great, thank you very much. Alicia.
The Day of Truth and Reconciliation for me is a day that this year I chose to reflect that my truth was that I'm very thankful that I didn't go to residential school because as a child, I watched buses come to my community to pick kids up to go to Prince Albert Residential School. So this happened in my lifetime and it's very real. And it means like that, you know, the government has to do their part in understanding how the doctrine of discovery and European sovereignty uphold narratives that, you know, that aren't really truthful or reconciliatory, that maintain the narrative of the residential schools and the policies set out in the late 1800s after Confederation to start these schools. So we need to really look at that, you know, specifically call to action 46 2 talks about repudiation of the concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, and the reformation of laws, governance structures, and policies within their respective institutions that continue to rely on such concepts.
Great, thank you. And just, I think, to help anybody who's listening, the doctrine of discovery is the principle that settlers use to say, hey, if nobody's inhabiting this land that I can tell, then it's free for me to just claim it for my own country. That's also the essence of terra nullius, which means nobody's land. And of course, that led to great injustice. David.
Thanks for having me. For Indigenous people, you know, for my family, it's always been about sharing the story, honoring the story, and celebrating our continued perseverance through all this. But most importantly is, you know, sticking our foot in the ground and saying never again. Now, I think TRC Day, or Truth and Reconciliation, should mean something a little bit different for non-Indigenous folk. And I would hope that for them, you know, they would ask what reconciliation means to them and what they can do to advance it.
Okay, well, that leads us to our next question then, and it's sort of following on what David just said, and that is, what would meaningful commemoration of the day be, including with employers, but also outside of employers as well? If we're okay to keep going with the same order, if anybody has any objections, if not, Leila.
Thanks, Craig. I feel like I can speak from an employee-employer's perspective, that employers should support members to attend events, wear orange, and do something meaningful, like recognize it as a stat day. Some paramedic services in Canada wore like orange epaulets on uniform shirts. I'm a paramedic, and nobody caught that in the beginning. And I think that it was really important, and I was really appreciative of the services that were able to do that. My service chose not to do that. Admittingly, I did violate a strict uniform policy and wore an orange shirt under my uniform shirt because it meant something to me. CUPE Ontario, they released statements, encouraged people to attend rallies, drum circles, sacred fires. They wore and sold orange shirts that the proceeds went to Indigenous causes. And all those things are extremely important. And it's a good starting point and a good stepping stone. It has to have a starting point.
Great. I like your point about wearing the orange shirt underneath everything, even though you weren't technically supposed to, because it had such a meaning for you. And I'm sure that they wouldn't have minded, especially if they allowed you to have the orange epaulets. Anyway, Alicia.
For me, way for employers or employees to commemorate this day would be to understand empathy for children and understand empathy for First Nations children that, like me, myself, I was once a First Nations child, to understand the systemic underfunding of schools, right from kindergarten to professional degrees, where schools are underfunded. Then when they go to post-sec, they're still underfunded. And the calls to action are to bring the funding up to par. This isn't hard for the government. They maintain a membership record of every status Indian in this country. I mean, affairs, very bureaucratic. So a day to that day, like commemorate this day and understanding that there's systemic inequities and systemic barriers that really keep First Nations children away from higher education and obtaining and having input in federal policies, federal policies that affect children, their health, and how this goes forward. Like it may be right now that this is like it kind of doesn't make sense to people because it's just so it's overwhelming for one thing to see a bunch of graves found on TV like, and then to think about these are children that never went back to their mothers. So this summer, I don't know if you saw, but on Parliament Hill, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Clan Mothers released an empty cradle board statement. And it was to mothers that to mourn their babies that never came home. So understand that there was federal policy directed at mothers, Indigenous mothers, First Nations, Aboriginal mothers that took their kids away. I watched a video of Chief Lookinghorse from, he's a traditional 19th generation calf pipe holder for the Lakota Sioux tribes in South Dakota. And he said that after basically the Treaty of Fort Laramie and those times that if you didn't give up your kid was shot in your hands. So it's you have to really understand the residual effects and the harms on mothers and children that happen. This is a truth. It happened. And what's the long-term effects and what's going to continue to happen when children were harmed and they grow up to be adults.
Thank you for that. And David, what would meaningful commemoration be for you?
Well, I definitely echo Alicia and Leila. For all our non-Indigenous allies and co-conspirators, hey, come be with us. When there was all those protests happening in downtown Toronto last year, people showed up, and I like to see that. But I'd like to see that all across the country. I'd like to see that here at Windsor. There's 20 people in this room right now. There should be over 100. Come be with us. We've been talking about this stuff for over 40 years now, trying to get the truth out. Well, the truth is out now. And so to echo Alicia's point, read the history. It's available. It's free. You can get it on the internet. The Truth and Reconciliation Report lays it out. It's not that long. It's not that hard of a read. And, if we uncovered every story instead of what was just in the TRC report, we'd be covering books and books of stories, but unfortunately we don't have the time and resources to uncover all those stories yet, but we should. And so that leads me to my third point, is that we need to institutionalize this. Now, making it a federal holiday and whatnot, that's certainly a step in institutionalizing it. I would like to see the provinces do it, but for your employers, your employers can do this on their own. You can take a day away, or you can set the day aside and say, hey, this is what we're going to cover today. We are going to cover the TRC because this is important and it's going to take everybody to move forward.
I like that idea you have of actually suggesting that employers provide some education, or at least ask somebody who's able to provide the education to the employees on that day. It's a great idea. What progress has been made and what progress still is needed to achieve true reconciliation? Leila, would you like to start?
Leila, yeah, you changed.
Leila, yeah.
Okay, this is a really important and a really difficult question to answer. So I would like people to reflect on this day, recognize the plight of the Indigenous people of Canada, The years of oppression, suppression, depression, recognize what happened to the Indigenous people of Canada, treat National Truth and Reconciliation Day as a day of remembrance and education, like David had said. It's frustrating for me to think that the first ever day of National Truth and Reconciliation, our very own Prime Minister went on vacation, went surfing in Tofino. There was no effort to reflect or to remember. There was no effort to raise awareness about residential schools. He took the day as a holiday, not a day to reflect and remember. I've seen progress though, and like the first steps of many steps that we have to collectively take towards reconciliation. It started. People are talking, people are asking questions, and people are having the conversation. And I think that's super important.
Thank you. And it's a very good point that our very own Prime Minister led by example, and he went and had a holiday surfing. He has since apologized for it, and he is meeting with some Indigenous representatives, but of course it would have been much better had he taken the day seriously in the first place. So anyway, thank you for mentioning that. Alicia.
Yeah, so the other day, the Prime Minister got, the cabinet got sworn in, the Liberal government, they got sworn in. And I sat here and I watched every member of Parliament walk up that hill. And I thought, wow, they all get to walk up there so peacefully with nice clothes to that nice building, holding their families' hands, holding their children's hands. But yet we, for a long time, mothers weren't able to do that. Native mothers, and it was legislated, weren't able to hold their children's hands. They weren't able to be proud of who they were, who they are. They weren't able to live out their treaty right, their responsibilities to land, their responsibility to carry on their teachings to their children. In Treaty 6, I'm tied to Treaty 6 because Treaty 6 states that as long as the grass grows, the sun shines, and the river flows. That river flows means that as long as Cree women continue to have water flowing from their wombs and they continue to give life and birth life in this world, that there will be a treaty. When the Pope is coming here, the Pope is coming to Canada. It's a perfect opportunity for allies to tell the Pope he needs to rescind the doctrine of discovery. He needs to stop the genocide against First Nations children, First Nations people in Canada. He needs to stop it. We need to have an uncomfortable conversation about what this means and how this relates to treaty processes.
Are you glad to hear that the Pope is coming?
Yeah, because you know what? My cousin gets to meet with him, I hope. I did see a media release that Grand Chief Arlen Dumas from the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, who's known to be very vocal, standing up for our rights, standing up for our people, and standing up to the government to say we could take care of our own people, we could take care of our own lands, give it back to us.
Great. David,
Yeah.
what progress do you think has been made, and more importantly, what still has to be done?
Well, there's a lot that has to be done. In October 30th, 1990 was the day Chief Phil Fontaine went on the news and blew the whistle on residential school abuses. He went on the news and talked very candidly about the sexual abuses that he suffered in the hands of these church clergy and whatnot. And since then, there was a lot of the rise of the internet. Indigenous people really started coming out of the woodwork with these stories about about the residential school experiences, and a lot of them were the same. The abuse, the sickness, murder, just the horrible stories. And it took a lot of effort from survivors to get that truth out. It's taken over 31 years at this point, and since then a lot of stuff has happened. We've had apologies across the board from this government, some churches, some officials. Stephen Harper in 2008, I believe. The Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says a lot, has given his apology and whatnot. But we need to move past apologies. Again, the TRC report came out in 2015. It has 94 calls to action. 94 calls to action are definitely not implemented. And I would argue that it's not even near where we need to be. And, this isn't something anybody is going home from. This is going to take a long time. This is not going to be a one and done, like, hey, we implemented these, we paid the survivors, let's not talk about this anymore. This is going to take a long time. This was an act of genocide. I know a lot of people try to diminish it by saying things like cultural genocide, but it's a genocide. That's what it is. Justin Trudeau has acknowledged it as such. And so, what does that mean for Canadian society? We need to move forward all together in a collaborative effort to solve this. And we need to uncover all the stories. There are so many stories that we still need to uncover. Just looking through the past genocides throughout history, the Holocaust, which is the most well-known example of a genocide, it's still studied today. It's still talked about every day, and the stories that come from the Holocaust are still being uncovered. The survivors and artifacts and whatnot, there's still so much we need to learn about what happened back then. It's going to be the exact same thing for residential schools. This is going to take over 100 years, I believe. And with new facts, we need to adjust and, adjust accordingly. And also additionally, TRC or Truth and Reconciliation isn't something that I believe is exclusive to Canada. Everything that happened here in Canada also happened in the United States. So Canada is in a unique position to do the right thing. And, God willing, the United States follows suit. And also abroad, we're not the only Indigenous people in this world. In South America, Australia, residential schools, they happen there too. This is going to be a worldwide movement, and it's never going to stop. Indigenous people weren't allowed legal representation until I believe the 1960s, or maybe it was the 1950s. And we're taking people to court now, and we have people in law school now. And we're, like I was telling Alicia the other day, there's going to be a flood of Indigenous lawyers coming, and we will resolve this through every means we know how, through the courts, through negotiations, through mediation. We are coming for land claims. We are coming for residential school claims. It's not going to stop, and so we need help. And it would be beneficial if the government worked with Indigenous people instead of against us. Thanks.
Great. I think you're right about the stories as well. And obviously there's been a number of news stories lately and media stories, but I think there has to be more than that. Probably books and movies, songs, those kinds of things. You mentioned the Holocaust. Look how many movies there has been about the Holocaust. Maybe this could be a start. And I do think you're right that the States, especially, but other countries have to also start going down this road as well. Anyway, what would you like people to take away from this conversation? Leila.
David, you're so powerful. I will follow you anywhere. I would like people to remember and to rectify, like, Listen to the survivors, like David said, listen to their stories. I'm very thankful for the people who are here tonight, because you guys are the ambassadors for change, and change is what we need. The next National Day of Truth and Reconciliation is 11 months away. And so I encourage everybody, if you haven't done so, read the 94 recommendations, visit friendship centers, ask questions, have conversations. And with municipal and provincial elections coming up, ask the candidates what they're doing to recognize truth and reconciliation. Vote accordingly.
What was the last part? Vote accordingly?
Vote accordingly.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Alicia.
Well, for this, I wrote down what I want people to take away is the history of the RCMP. The RCMP were the people that came to the communities or river camps, because that's how they came, was by boat. A lot of places, reserves, or places where you would find First Nations people was in the bush, basically. And the RCMP came by force. You know, it was illegal. It was illegal not to send your kids there. You would be imprisoned, or just think that if the RCMP came to get your kids at your house right now, like why would that be allowed? Why was it allowed? It's not normal. So the RCMP's federal budget, this was a few years back, to Gabriel Fade out of Ottawa. She's an Indigenous woman. She said that about 60 to 70% of the federal RCMP budget in Canada is used to police First Nations on reserve communities. That's alarming. It's alarming just to think about that. It's daunting. Why are we still having RCMP? And RCMP can only enforce the criminal code. So, you know, it's kind of like yesterday, the RCMP arrested a traditional chief in Wet'suwet'en territory. They're still committing acts of genocide. We have our own laws. It's Cree people, as Haudenosaunee. The Haudenosaunee have the Confederacy. We have our own laws, Nihiao laws. On the West Coast, they have their houses and potlatch, feast centers. They have stewards of the land, they're chiefs. They have a responsibility to care for the land. Our CMP come in and arrest people for wanting to have clean drinking water, for wanting to protect what little they have left, what's been taken so much for corporate interests. As a society, are we benefiting from that? We're just turning a blind eye to say, well, that's not happening in BC today. Did the government report on it? Did the TVs, the news report on it? There was a chief, traditional chief, that has a responsibility to care for the land. Breaking the laws, you're breaking our laws, their laws. Is that okay? Like, morally, is it okay to continue to fund our CMP when 60 to 70% of their budget is for First Nations reserves on reserve communities? We represent 5% of the population of Canada, and 70% of the whole federal budget for RCMP is for 5% of a segment of a population. Those numbers are just not, doesn't add up. So take away the history of the RCMP from today. Check it out. Check it out what their budgets are today, because it's public information.
Great. Would you like to see RCMP disallowed from operating on Native lands, or have a reduced authority?
I would like to see them get out because, you know, this summer my cousin was, she died in the Sunny Bay RCMP detachment. There was 5. She was put into a shower cell, and there's 5 cells in there with 5 men housed in there that heard and witnessed to RCMP beat her up, and they were in a shower cell. And she died. They heard her cry to her death. So that for that reason alone, I would like the RCMP out of communities to be defunded, to have restorative practice, justice practices put into place, meaning that justice is dealt with at a community level, and that Indigenous women and men are not sent out to urban centers to be criminalized. They're not supplying, like for example, Prince Albert, there's a penitentiary there. There's, I don't know if it's 1 or 2 correctional facilities, but a lot of the city is employed from these jail systems, and they're 80 to 90% housed with Native people. So the RCMP are the ones that say, you get in charge, you're going to this facility, and we're over policed. So bottom line is we're over policed, and your taxpayer dollars pay for it. So think about that.
Thank you. David, what would you like people to take away from this conversation?
Yeah, I'm going to echo a little bit on what Alicia said, is that the tools of colonialism are still there. There's a lot of discussion in the media over the past few years about, you know, what is the liability of Canada acknowledging what has happened as a genocide. You know, can charges be brought against Canada in the international courts for genocide? Because that means Canada would join a very, you know, infamous, unique club of countries that have committed a genocide. And, you know, there are some politicians that think, you know, oh, they don't want to admit it's a genocide, or they, you know, it wouldn't be a good look for them. And it's, they think that, you know, this is something that happened in the past. But all the tools of colonialism, all the cogs are still turning today. They're turning with the RCMP, they're turning with child welfare, they're turning with systemic racism, healthcare. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. And it's going to take everybody to fix this. And so, you know, if there was anything that I could just explicitly state to anybody that's listening, that you're a part of this. Okay, settler privileges came at a very great cost to Indigenous people, and they still do. Now, do you want to keep going like this forever? You know, or do you want to be good neighbors? You know, do we want to embrace each other? That's how this relationship was supposed to be. That's how it all started. When we exchanged those wampum belts in the 1600s, we said, you stay in your lane, we'll stay in ours, and we'll work together as friends. Well, that never happened, or it hasn't happened in a long time. So let's get back to it.
Very good. Would you ever consider running for office?
Absolutely.
Last question that I have, and it's more of a personal one, is there a story you can share about your own personal journey that helps partly explain what the Indigenous experience is today? And I guess we could again start with Leila.
I'll tell you a story.
Okay.
I don't think the Indigenous experience has changed much from yesteryears. I responded to a call, and when I got there, it was at a safe consumption site for a person who was unconscious. And the woman that was running the safe consumption site like rushed over to the ambulance, and she was like, "Oh, it's one of our Indigenous clientele." Like it was a big deal. And I was like, "Oh, good. I'm one of your Indigenous paramedics." And she just looked at me like she was so confused. There was no embarrassment. It was confusion. So then I was like, I thought about it, like, is that racism, or was it her trying to be sensitive to the patient? Like, I wasn't sure, but like, I don't fit into your stereotypes. We don't fit into your stereotypes. So it would be nice for people to treat people like humans, treat everybody with kindness. You know, my mom always said, you know, like if you don't have something good to say, don't say anything at all. My dad was kind of the guy that was like, you know, treat everybody how you'd want them to treat your own family. Recently, my employer started diversity training, and there was a section done by the Fort Erie Friendship Center in the Niagara Native Friendship Center. And they were just talking about the plight of the Indigenous people through history. And it really opened everybody's eyes, and people started phoning me and apologizing for historical wrongs. So it was incredibly eye-opening for them. And most of them admitted they had no idea the atrocities the Indigenous people of Canada faced. So that's another step in the right direction. If we educate people and they know what we're dealing with, maybe things will become more respectful and kind.
Thank you. Yeah. Alicia, do you have any personal thoughts or stories that you can relate?
Leila, it's funny you talk about respectful and kind, because when I wrote my application for law school, that was my basis for becoming a lawyer, was so that I could improve, so I could make sure that the government is respectful and kind to First Nations kids, to my nieces and to my nephews that have to grow up in these education systems, to my nieces and nephews that have to grow up in my community that's over policed by RCMP. You know, to my nieces and nephews that don't understand how settlers tax dollars fund police violence. That, you know, to my nieces and nephews that don't understand why Indigenous women like myself are underfunded, why I have to fight for funding every year. Like I told myself I'm gonna become treaty, membership to Treaty 6. So I can go to school and I won't have to worry about I'm gonna feed myself, because that's my treaty right. I'm an Indian. Basically, that's what we're termed as, right? Under the federal government, we're Indians. We're in the Constitution, are Aboriginal, but under the Constitution, our rights are upheld, right? And if our rights are upheld, why are we not funded? Why am I not funded? Why am I going to school without money? And I have a treaty right. And that treaty right is a right to education. So our systems don't reflect our treaties. Our systems don't reflect the foundation that our society and our country and our systems were built on. Like others get to benefit. Others get to get their work done. Others get to get A's. Others get to live a life and get to have extracurricular activities. They don't have to survive. There's a difference of surviving, and there's a difference of having a quality of life. So when are we gonna stop allowing First Nations children, First Nations women to have to survive? When are we gonna stop the funding inequities? There's a big gap. Pretty much 60%, I believe my professor told me last year. I have a 4-year an honors degree in Indigenous studies. So a lot of the work I've done has been on community well-being and hydroelectric development in Treaty 10 territory. Like you said, blueberries as medicine. I did I did research with the Canada Research Chair in the Indigenous community well-being. I did an intensive research summer program, and that was the topic I chose because that's what I knew growing up, and I wanted to understand how blueberries were a staple to our diet and how blueberries were used and how it's a staple to community well-being or individual well-being. And, basically, it like cleans you out. It's fibrous and it takes out heavy metal buildup in your body, which we have in our water. We have PCBs and methyl mercury bioaccumulation in the fish and bioaccumulation in wildlife and in the people, because it was dumped in our lands. So there's seepages, it was dumped for 40, 50 years. So those seepages are still there. So, as a lawyer, I would like to understand how being kind and respectful falls into Ministry of Environment, Ministry of whatever, how it pertains to water and children, my nieces and nephews in my community, and their ability to turn the tap on and have clean drinking water that's free of heavy metals and free of methyl mercury, which is a neurotoxin. And, that's my job as a lawyer. And that's my personal experience. It's like, to understand that, even though Taspara makes billions of dollars 2 kilometers upstream from my community, we're still underfunded at 60%. We're still underfunded within Treaty 6 membership. I still don't have tuition money. So this is really personal to me, that to understand how our systems are not kind and respectful to us still today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you relating some of that personal stuff. And sorry about that. David, are you able to relate anything personal that can help shed light on that?
Yeah, like I've been saying all night, is that there's so many stories that are yet to be uncovered, and I've always been very open about my story. My father's a residential school survivor. He left home at a very early age. He was kind of a vagabond in his early years. I left home at 16, I think, or maybe 15. He was a lumberjack, just like his father was a lumberjack. So naturally, I became a lawyer, And so, yeah, my dad left home at an early age, and he traveled to the States. And I always my dad told me stories about, growing up and police abuse and racism and the schools. And so I knew this history at an early age. I was exposed to it. But, I was educated in a Western education system. I'm an American student. And so, these things were just never talked about in any Western paradigm. At best, they were, glossed over, and at worst, they were flatly denied. And so that created a lot of dissonance for me. And, the time my dad was away, he didn't return to the reserve for, I believe, over 20 years. He moved to Chicago, he moved to Michigan, ended up landing a job at General Motors. Sometime during that time frame, I was born, and I was raised kind of in the Western world and through my dad's knowledge, and now I'm back. Now I'm back in Canada. Now I'm back in this legal system to seek justice. And so I always kind of thought of that as like, my dad's journey is kind of coming full circle through me. I want to get to the bottom of this. I want to, I want to help make my people whole.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We do have a question from the audience. What are your thoughts on how galleries, museums, public libraries, archives, and other heritage institutions should commemorate the day? I know this year some opted to stay open, some opted to close, some opted to do a combination. And as we've been doing all night, could we start with Leila?
Absolutely. Galleries, museums, public libraries, and archives, and heritage institutions, those are great ways to promote Indigenous history and truth and reconciliation. And I think like I would love to see like maybe some shortened hours so that those people can go and remember and reflect on that day. But I think it would be a great opportunity for them to provide some knowledge and education, perhaps pull in somebody from the local friendship center to maybe have like a drum session or a question answer period. I just wouldn't want to see an opportunity lost. So I would say keep them open, maybe shortened hours.
Excellent. Alicia.
Teach people about the treaties. That is what people don't understand. That this treaties are what form this country. Treaties are the foundation of this country. You know, we're a democratic society. Like David said, we have wampum belts. We have the you know, last year Minister Mark Miller went to Pitawanakwat territory to polish the covenant chain. So that means that polish the covenant chain means to have good relations. And good relations mean rescinding the doctrine of discovery. It means changing the laws. It means changing the Constitution. It means having a hand-in-hand relationship, a respect for differences, a respect for responsibilities. You know, the Prime Minister likes to say rights recognition, right recognition frameworks. No, we don't have rights. We have responsibilities. We have responsibilities to children. We have responsibilities to future generations. We have responsibilities to maintain the land so children can have somewhere to eat, because in most communities, like my community, we don't have a grocery store, and most First Nations communities are like that. Even just down the road from Hamilton here, 20 minutes, Six Nations, there's no grocery stores there. Most people are, they eat off the land, harvest food. So, yeah.
Well, and so specifically, obviously, you want there to be more education about in Indigenous culture and experience, but and also you would like to see. I'm thinking you were suggesting that you would like to see museums also take part in some way doing that.
Yes, educating others about the history of the treaties, how the treaties stand today, where they are, where the treaty territories are. What people are affected, what people have been displaced, what, like, for example, I live close by the Haldeman Tract. The Haldeman Tract is from 1700s. It was granted to the Six Nations Haudenosaunee Confederacy for their role, I believe, in the Revolutionary War. Don't quote me on that, but their war alliance. It was granted by the king, and it was from 6 miles on each side of the Grand River from its mouth to its source. So that treaty stands today, it's forever. And at Six Nations, 90% of the reserve does not have accessible drinking water. So we, like David said, how can Canada be taken to international courts? When is there an intervention to say, well, we're having third world conditions inside a first world country, so it makes it fourth world, right? That's what I've read anyways and been taught, that most reserves have fourth world conditions. That's third world living conditions inside a first world country. So we need to bring our country up to par with all of our citizens having that same privilege and ability to live in a first world country.
Thank you very much. David, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, you know, I would just specifically address museums because this is something that I've been working on here stateside, is that you know, if you're a museum, if you work in a museum, you have some type of power at a museum, and you don't have any Indigenous connection, well, why not? You know, this is something that is very concerning for me because there are so many, especially Anishinaabeg artifacts in museums throughout the region. Birch bark scrolls, wampum belts, you name it. These are very sacred items. And a lot of times in museums, they are put on display as if they're art. And they're not just art. Wampum belts are contracts in their own right. Birch bark scrolls are religious documents. These are very important to Indigenous people. So, you know, I would encourage museums especially to reopen or create some type of relationship with the Indigenous people, you know, where they're located at, and also consider repatriating these artifacts. Just a couple of weeks ago, they found a stone knife under the, I think it was the Parliament building in Ottawa. And, you know, they did the right thing. They repatriated it. So, you know, why, you know, it's really disturbing to me that so many museums, you know, don't want to open up these talks because, you know, it's part of their collection. Well, you know, it's a lot more than that to me. And so if you really want to be a part of Truth and Reconciliation, you know, have that conversation. It's going to be hard. It's going to be tough. And, you know, it's sometimes there's going to be tension, but it's a conversation that's going to be need to be had if you're serious about reconciliation.
And just so I'm clear, are you suggesting that if galleries or museums have any Indigenous artifacts that they display, that they return them to the Indigenous community? Or would you still like them to keep displaying them?
Absolutely. I would like to see them returned, but you know, if the Indigenous community would like to have them on display, that is excellent. You know, education is a great thing for the general public. But if they don't want them on display, there are some very sacred items that you know, I've seen on display as art in museums in my time, specifically birch bark scrolls. And honestly, I don't think those should be on display for the general public.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions, so I'd like to ask if any of our excuse me, if any of our panelists have any last points you would like to make. You don't have to, but you're certainly welcome to. Anybody who, or do you feel like you've addressed it pretty good?
I will.
Okay.
I'd like to ask that those watching that you make it a point to ensure that First Nations children get adequate education funding, that they receive the same resources as other citizens in Canada, and that they stop being harmed, that the state harms do not continue. Also, one thing that stuck out to me is the spanking law. I think it's section 43. I can't quote that right now, but there's a spanking law. And what that law is when children go into the state's control, they have the authority to use force. I know this because last month my sister was in a youth facility and she was tackled and restrained, and that bothered me. I said, can they do that? And it's still existent. So it's kind of like what the churches and the Red Cross, like, you have to look at what the history is and how certain organizations were funded to execute these residential schools. The Red Cross specifically came to my community and did it, but yet we're not compensated as residential survivors or day school survivors. We're just left out of the loop because the province says they had municipality there, but they're lying. They never did. We never gave up anything. It was just kind of forced, and it was forced because the Red Cross came in and controlled kids and kind of breeded these kids up to understand that they're less than and not to have a voice back to authority. So a lot of what happened in residential schools was you never saw anything and you don't say anything. So this idea still it's a residual effect, and a lot of residential school survivors or their children carry this thinking, and it's hard for them to speak up. So as law students, we're kind of in that position to speak for those that can't speak for themselves.
Great, thank you very much. Anybody else want to make a last comment?
Thanks for being here, everybody.
Thanks so much. And just before I turn it back over to Abby Lee, I just wanted to thank the panelists for being here. It was a really frank discussion. I am being honest when I say this. I really enjoyed it. I have not had a conversation like this with people providing such interesting perspectives and also such enlightening perspectives. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And I would like to turn it back to the Art Gallery of Windsor's very capable Abby Lee.
That is very kind. Thank you. I have to say, forgive me if I'm like a little speechless, because it's been, it's no exaggeration to say it's an incredible privilege to be able to have you here, Alicia, Leila, and David, sharing all of your knowledge and your perspectives. Like, we are so grateful to have been able to be in this space with you today. So thank you. I'm going to say thank you again a bunch of times. Before I do that, we're going to do as I said at the beginning, and we're going to launch the second poll with similar questions as the first to see if any perspectives have been changed, or to see if anyone perhaps wants to take on further learning. So I'm going to launch poll number 2 for about a minute, and we'll see and compare the results when it closes. Awesome. I'll give it about 15 more seconds. I'm seeing a lot of engagement, so that's wonderful. All right, 3, 2, 1. Oh, one person just got in. Okay, ending the poll, and I'm going to share the results now. So for the first question, would you honor National Day of Truth and Reconciliation in the same way next year? So this did, well, I'll go back. In the first question, 91% of people said that they did honor the day in some way. With this question now, 64% of people say they would honor it in the same way. 36% of people say that they would honor it in a different way, perhaps based on what they've listened to tonight. For number 2, knowing what you know now, would you read or reread the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada? For contrast, in the first poll, 64% of people said they had read it. 36% of people say they had not. We've got 100% of people now who say that they are going to read or reread it, which is really, really interesting to see. So thank you for answering that. And last but not least, will you read the story of Phyllis Webstad and her orange shirt, and or encourage friends, family, or colleagues to read the story? Comparing with the first poll, 82% of people had read the story, 18% of people had not. Again, we've got a unanimous 100% of people who said that they would read the story and or would encourage their family and friends to do so. So it seems clear that the folks in this conversation were quite impacted by what you all had to say. So again, we are so grateful, so privileged to have you. And thank you very much to all of our attendees tonight for being with us in this conversation, coming with us on this conversation on this Thursday evening. We really appreciate it. And we hope to see you either at future conversations or perhaps see you in the gallery as well sometime soon. But for now, I'll say another thank you to everyone and bid everybody a good night. Take care, everyone.
Thanks very much and good night.